The air is thick with the mingled scents of olive oil, sweat, and roasting meat from the street vendors' stalls. The Forum of Rome is alive with the usual chorus of voices, merchants shouting prices over the din, senators exchanging clipped whispers in shaded colonnades, beggars calling out for alms, and somewhere, faintly, the sound of a lyre drifting from a portico. And then, a sudden hush rolls like a ripple through the crowd. Heads turn. The emperor himself is approaching. Nero, draped in the deep crimson of imperial power, his tunic's golden thread catching the sunlight like a flare. His stride is leisurely, as though he owns the very stones beneath his feet, which, in truth, he does. But it isn't just Nero who holds their gaze. It is the figure at his side. She is dazzling. A young woman, her hair shining beneath a veil of fine silk, every step releasing the shimmer of jewels from India and pearls from distant Britannia. Her face is composed, serene, the perfect portrait of imperial grace. And yet, the murmurs begin before she has passed. A strange, brittle sound, half curiosity, half horror, passed from mouth to mouth like a secret too potent to keep. Because those who know the truth know that the empress walking beside the most powerful man in the world was not born a woman. Once, not so long ago, that delicate face had belonged to a boy named Sporus. And what Nero had done to him, what he had forced him to become, would be whispered about in the darker corners of Rome for generations. It is a story not of mere scandal, but of possession, taken to its most chilling extreme. This was no ordinary act of imperial indulgence. It was a transformation born from grief so warped by power that it had rotted into obsession. And in the heart of that obsession lay the destruction of a human soul. The Romans were no strangers to rumors, of course. The Forum itself was as much a marketplace for gossip as it was for grain and cloth. Here, information was traded like currency, and reputations could be bought, sold, or destroyed in the time it took to cross the square. But this was different. The whispers were not the playful, conspiratorial kind that accompany the flirtations of senators' wives or the minor scandals of the wealthy. This was a collective shudder, a recognition that they were watching the performance of something profoundly unnatural. And yet, like all performances in Rome, it had its audience. Some watched with fascination, others with revulsion. Many, wisely, kept their faces blank. Because in Nero's Rome, to show disgust at the emperor's private life was to court ruin. The truth of Sporus's fate, how a boy from the imperial household would be sculpted surgically and socially into the reflection of a dead woman, was still mostly hidden from public knowledge. But even without the details, the outline was clear enough to those versed in the dangerous theatre of imperial politics. This marriage was a show of power as much as it was an act of desire, and shows of power in Rome were never to be taken lightly. But to understand how the city had reached this point, how the boy Sporus found himself parading as the empress of Rome, we must start not with him, but with the man who orchestrated it all, Nero. It is tempting to think of him only in his later infamy, the tyrant who set his capital aflame, the artist king whose vanity outstripped his sanity. But that is the danger of looking backward with knowledge of the end. The truth is that Nero was not born into cruelty. His reign began, in fact, with promise. When he took the throne at the tender age of 16, many in Rome dared to hope they were entering a golden age. The day of his accession had been one of almost festive relief. After the turbulent reign of his predecessor, the idea of a youthful, well-educated, and, by all appearances, gracious emperor was intoxicating. He lowered taxes, sponsored games for the people, and performed music and poetry for adoring crowds. For a while, the Senate smiled on him. Even the commoners who so often bore the brunt of Rome's politics found reason to cheer. And yet, in the corridors of the Palatine Hill, shadows already lengthened. Because Rome had seen this before, young rulers who began with benevolence but, once steeped in the intoxicating brew of unchecked authority, descended into tyranny. Perhaps Nero's fall was inevitable, or perhaps it was shaped in part by what came next, the meeting of the young emperor with a woman who would ignite in him a passion unlike any he had known before. Her name was Poppaea Sabina. And in that meeting, lay the seed of the tragedy that would one day engulf Sporus. Nero was not born into the purple as a certainty. His path to the throne was the product of intricate dynastic maneuvering, marriages arranged, heirs displaced, and alliances forged in the brittle, glittering world of Julio-Claudian politics. By the time he was formally adopted by Emperor Claudius, he was already being groomed for the role that would define and ultimately consume his life. When he took power in 54 AD, just 16 years old, Rome saw in him the image of renewal, a boy emperor with a poet's tongue, a taste for music, and, at least at first, a surprisingly measured approach to governance. His first speeches to the Senate were modest, almost deferential, speaking of shared power and respect for tradition. It was the kind of language Rome hadn't heard from its ruler in decades, and the city was hungry for it. In those early years, his actions seemed to match his promises. He reduced burdensome taxes, making a public show of listening to complaints from ordinary citizens. He poured resources into public entertainment, funding gladiatorial games, chariot races, and theatrical performances. The Colosseum would not be built for another generation, but the Circus Maximus thundered with the hooves of horses racing under Nero's patronage, the crowds roaring with approval. Even his artistic ambitions, though unusual for an emperor, initially endeared him to the masses. Nero performed music and poetry before live audiences, taking the stage in gilded robes. The patrician elite muttered that such theatrics were beneath the dignity of the Caesar, but to the common people it was a mark of his accessibility. Here was an emperor who didn't hide behind marble walls, but who mingled, however theatrically, with his subjects. And yet, woven through this promising start were the threads of something darker. The historian Tacitus later suggested that Nero's benevolence was not born of humility, but of youthful naivety, easily swayed by those around him. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, held considerable influence in those first years, guiding decisions and positioning herself as co-ruler in all but name. This uneasy arrangement would not last. As Nero grew older, the friction between them intensified, a young man impatient to prove himself against a mother who had helped place him on the throne. Their relationship ended in blood, Agrippina's assassination ordered by the very son she had raised to rule. If there was a turning point in Nero's psyche, it may have been this severing of his last true familial bond. In Roman political culture, killing one's own kin was a stain that never quite faded, but it also carried a perverse liberation. Nero, unbound from even maternal restraint, was now answerable to no one. It was during this period of newfound autonomy that he began to indulge his artistic passions to an obsessive degree. Hours spent composing songs, rehearsing monologues, and studying Greek tragedies were hours not spent governing. The empire, vast, complex, and restless, required an emperor's constant attention. But Nero preferred the stage lights to the Senate floor. Still, the Rome of the mid-60s AD was not yet openly hostile to him. The grain fleets arrived, the treasury, though strained, still functioned, and the military remained outwardly loyal. But beneath the surface, cracks began to show. The court became a place where truth bent to the emperor's whims. Those who displeased him were quietly exiled or executed, their property confiscated to fund his spectacles. Senators learned to read his moods with the care of a sailor watching the sky for storms. And then, into this increasingly unstable world, walked Poppaea Sabina. To Nero, she seemed to embody everything Rome's ideals promised, beauty as radiant as the marble of the Forum, wit sharp enough to cut through the layers of courtly deception, and an ambition to match his own. To those watching from the shadows, however, she was also a woman who knew how to turn the emperor's attention into a weapon. When their paths crossed, Nero was still married. To Octavia, the dignified daughter of the late Emperor Claudius. Their union was entirely political, born of strategy rather than love. Octavia was quiet, dutiful, and, in Nero's eyes, dull. Poppaea was her opposite in every way, vivacious, magnetic, impossible to ignore. And once Nero noticed her, there would be no going back. Poppaea Sabina did not enter Nero's life like a whisper. She arrived like a flare in the darkness, impossible to ignore, dazzling, and dangerous to stare at for too long. Born into a well-connected family, she had been raised among the elite, her early life shaped by the twin Roman ideals of beauty and ambition. Her skin was said to be so luminous she bathed in donkey's milk to preserve it, her hair a cascade of gold that framed a face sculpted for the marble busts of the imperial court. But beneath the surface glitter was a mind as sharp as any senator's dagger. In the Rome of the 1st century AD, beauty could be a kind of weapon, but wielding it successfully required precision. Poppaea understood this. She had already been married, twice, before she caught Nero's eye, each union serving as a stepping stone toward greater influence. The sources disagree on whether she pursued Nero deliberately or whether fate simply placed them in each other's orbit. What they do agree on is the speed and intensity of Nero's infatuation once they met. At that time, Nero's wife, Octavia, embodied the ideal of the traditional Roman matron, modest, loyal, and silent in public affairs. To some, these were virtues. To Nero, they were voids. Octavia's restraint seemed to wither beside Poppaea's radiance. Where Octavia avoided the public gaze, Poppaea reveled in it. Where Octavia spoke little, Poppaea commanded conversations, weaving compliments and cutting remarks with equal ease. It began as a scandal whispered in private dining rooms, an affair between the emperor and the most captivating woman in Rome. But in the imperial court, scandals rarely stayed private for long. Poppaea's presence at Nero's side grew bolder, her influence more visible. She attended public events where she laughed too loudly at his jokes, leaned in too close, her hand brushing his as though the gesture were an accident. Everyone noticed. And that was precisely the point. For Nero, Poppaea was more than a lover. She was an intoxicating mix of muse and co-conspirator. Ancient historians describe him during this time as increasingly impatient with anyone who criticized her or questioned her place at his side. He began making decisions to please her, no matter the political cost. Gifts flowed to her from every corner of the empire, silks from China, pearls from the Red Sea, spices and perfumes from Arabia. These were not tokens of affection. They were trophies. Proof to the court that he could and would bend the wealth of Rome to her pleasure. But Poppaea was no mere ornament. She had ambitions of her own, and she knew how to cultivate them. She built alliances quietly, rewarding those who supported her rise and isolating those who stood in her way. Her network of loyalists grew within the palace walls, slaves, secretaries, and freedmen who owed their positions to her influence. She understood that power in Rome was never secure unless it was fortified on all sides. Yet Poppaea was also shrewd enough to see the risks. Nero's affections, once won, could just as easily turn to resentment if she failed to hold his attention. She had seen what happened to those who fell from favor. Survival in the imperial court was a game played without rules, and the only certainty was that no one, not even the emperor's favorite, was untouchable. It is in this balance, between allure and danger, that the seeds of tragedy began to germinate. For if Poppaea was capable of steering Nero's passions, she was equally capable of igniting his wrath. She was no silent companion, and her sharp tongue, so charming in courtly flirtation, could cut deep when turned on him in private. This dynamic, mutual infatuation sharpened by mutual volatility, would soon push their relationship into a realm from which neither could return unchanged. Nero's obsession, already intense, began to swell into something far more consuming, and Poppaea, ever confident in her ability to navigate imperial storms, may have underestimated just how destructive that obsession could become when tethered to absolute power. What began as a Roman courtship, public admiration, and private indulgence quickly mutated into something darker. Nero was no longer simply in love with Poppaea Sabina. He was possessed by her. In the way a man might be possessed by a vision or a haunting, every decision he made seemed to orbit her as if she were the sun and he merely a planet caught in her gravity. It began with the gifts, not mere trinkets, but treasures that would have staggered even the wealthiest patrician. He draped her in necklaces of Indian sapphires, their deep blue polished smooth by sea voyages that had carried them thousands of miles. He imported silks from the Far East, shimmering fabrics that clung to her like flowing water. From the Arabian Peninsula came glass vials of perfume so potent that, according to later rumor, a single drop could perfume an entire chamber for days. But even an emperor's treasury is not bottomless. Each extravagant shipment drained resources that might have funded legions, repaired aqueducts, or secured Rome's grain supply. The court noticed, so did the Senate, yet no one dared say so openly. The last man who had suggested Nero temper his spending had been exiled to a remote island, and that was one of the lucky endings. Soon, Nero's fixation passed beyond the realm of wealth and into the domain of control. Poppaea was rarely seen without a ring of guards, ostensibly to protect her, but in truth, to monitor her every move. The emperor's paranoia was such that if another man so much as let his gaze linger on her at a banquet, Nero's temper could ignite into dangerous suspicion. At first, Poppaea appeared to enjoy the intensity of his devotion. To have Rome's supreme ruler so openly enthralled was no small prize, but the line between passion and possession blurred quickly. Ancient sources tell of Nero commissioning dozens of portraits and marble busts of her likeness, some placed in public spaces, others kept in private rooms where only he could see them. It was as though he feared her image might vanish if not fixed in stone or pigment. Perhaps most unsettling was his habit of watching her for hours as she moved about her private chambers, not speaking, not touching, simply observing. To Nero, this might have been love, the purest form of admiration. To an outside eye, it was something closer to ownership. In Roman law, a man could own slaves, estates, and artworks. Nero had begun to treat Poppaea as though she were all three. Poppaea, for her part, was not blind to the danger. She was astute enough to know that in pleasing Nero, she secured her own safety and the advancement of her allies, but also aware that her influence came at the cost of her independence. Those in her private circle noticed subtle changes. She appeared at fewer gatherings without Nero. Conversations she once commanded freely were now carefully measured. Still, she remained unafraid to speak her mind to him in private. This, perhaps, was her most dangerous quality. Most in the imperial court had long since learned the art of anticipating the emperor's moods and agreeing with him regardless of the matter. Poppaea had no such habit. She criticized his decisions, scoffed at his more eccentric performances, and even mocked his artistic ambitions when she deemed them unworthy. It was a perilous dance. For all his power, Nero craved the validation of those he desired most, and Poppaea's disapproval could wound him like no others. In a man who already lived under the constant shadow of paranoia, this was a volatile mix. And so, in the sweltering summer of 65 AD, their volatile union reached its breaking point. What had once been whispered as a romance for the ages was now whispered as a tragedy waiting to happen. It happened in the heat of the Roman summer, when the air in the marble halls of the Palatine clung heavy and still. By 65 AD, Nero and Poppaea's relationship had shifted from intoxicating romance to a constant oscillation between tenderness and rage. Those in the imperial household learned to read the signs, the clipped answers, the tightened jaw, the way Poppaea would turn her gaze away from him during a public function. The exact cause of their final quarrel is still debated by historians. Suetonius claimed it began with a simple domestic dispute, Poppaea confronting Nero for coming home late from the chariot races. Cassius Dio suggested it was about his endless theatrical performances, a habit she openly mocked as beneath the dignity of the emperor. Tacitus, perhaps the most vivid of the ancient chroniclers, believed the argument was political. Poppaea, heavily pregnant, had accused Nero of caring more about his reputation as a performer than his duties as a ruler or as a father. Whichever version is true, the thread running through all of them is the same. Poppaea pushed back, and Nero, unaccustomed to resistance, snapped. The fight escalated quickly, the voices of the most powerful couple in Rome echoing through the palace. Servants, trained to be invisible, withdrew into corners, their eyes fixed on the floor. And then came the moment, sudden, brutal, irreversible. Some say it was a single vicious kick to her abdomen. Others describe a flurry of blows, his rage blinding him to the life growing inside her. What is certain is that the violence was devastating. Poppaea collapsed onto the marble floor, her silk gown pooling around her like a spilled chalice of wine. Blood began to stain the white stone. When the red haze of his anger cleared, Nero saw not his wife defiant and sharp-tongued, but the woman he had once adored, now gasping, fading, and beyond his power to save. He was the emperor of the Roman world, commander of 30 legions, a man who could summon armies with a gesture. But here, he was helpless. Panic took him. Ancient accounts tell of Nero cradling her body, begging her to forgive him, alternately weeping and commanding her to live as if his imperial authority could reach into the realm of the dead. Physicians were summoned in haste, men accustomed to treating the wounds of gladiators and soldiers. But unprepared for this, Nero promised them fortunes if they could save her, threatened them with death if they failed. But the injuries were too severe. By nightfall, Poppaea Sabina was gone, and with her, the unborn child who might have been the emperor's heir. In Roman tradition, the body of the dead was cremated swiftly, the ashes placed in urns and interred. But Nero defied custom. He had Poppaea's body embalmed and entombed in a mausoleum more elaborate than those of previous emperors. He declared her a goddess, established a cult in her honor, and ordered the court to speak of her as though she was still alive. At banquets, her seat was left empty. Courtiers were expected to address her in the present tense, toasting her health as if she were only absent from the room. Those who broke the illusion were punished. Some were exiled, others vanished entirely. It was in this fevered atmosphere of grief and denial that Nero's gaze would fall upon a young man named Sporus, a gaze that would change his life forever. Sporus was, at first, an unremarkable figure in the sprawling machinery of the imperial court. A beautiful youth, yes, but in Rome, beauty was a common enough currency, traded and spent quickly in the shadowed halls of power. His origins are uncertain. Some sources suggest he was a slave in the household, perhaps serving in the retinue of a high-ranking official. Others hint that he was the property of one of Nero's freedmen before catching the emperor's eye. What is certain is that Nero noticed him in the months after Poppaea's death, when grief had warped into something stranger, an obsession not merely with her memory, but with the idea of her. Nero had not simply lost a wife, he had lost the image of perfection he had built around her. And so, when he saw in Sporus a delicate profile, a certain softness in the eyes, a curve of the lips that stirred old memories, the thought took root. What if Poppaea could be replaced? The plan was as grotesque as it was calculated. Nero ordered that Sporus be castrated, removing, in the emperor's mind, the final barrier to reshaping him into a living echo of the woman he had killed. The surgery was carried out with the primitive and brutal methods of the time. Many would not have survived such a procedure, but Sporus did, though at unimaginable cost. From that moment on, Nero began his transformation. Sporus was dressed in the finest silks, adorned with Poppaea's jewelry, and trained to mimic her posture, her gestures, even her voice. Tailors and hairdressers were instructed to reproduce her elaborate hairstyles. Painters were brought in to capture Sporus's likeness in Poppaea's favorite poses, as though updating a portrait series. But Nero did not stop at artifice. In one of the most bizarre acts in imperial history, he staged a public marriage to Sporus. The ceremony was performed with all the pomp and ritual of a state wedding. Nero himself took the role of groom. Sporus, in the role of bride, wore the bridal veil, the flammeum, and the traditional marriage crown. The imperial household attended, some in stunned silence, others performing the expected congratulatory gestures, their survival hinging on the appearance of approval. From then on, Sporus accompanied Nero everywhere, banquets, public games, even official ceremonies, addressed by courtiers as Sabina or Augusta. Those who had known the real Poppaea spoke her name cautiously, aware that any perceived disrespect toward her living form could be fatal. Whether Sporus submitted out of fear, calculation, or a desperate instinct for survival is lost to history. To refuse Nero was unthinkable. To accept was to surrender one's identity entirely. And so, Sporus lived in a twilight existence, half person, half projection, his own life consumed by the shadow of another's. To the wider Roman world, the sight of the emperor parading his bride through the streets provoked everything from shock to disgust to whispered fascination. It was to many the final proof that Nero had descended beyond the reach of reason. But within the palace, this marriage to a ghost, this attempt to resurrect the dead in flesh, was treated as an imperial reality. In Sporus, Nero believed he had undone the loss of Poppaea. In truth, he had only deepened the wound. The living could not compete with the perfection of the dead, and the illusion he had created demanded constant maintenance. Sporus could never falter, never break the illusion, without risking everything. And as the emperor's reign spiraled toward collapse, the boy, who had been remade into a dead empress, would find himself dragged into the final, desperate chapters of Nero's life. After his marriage to Sporus, Nero's life became a theatre without curtains, and Rome his unwilling audience. Sporus was not merely present, he was everywhere. He sat beside Nero at the races, walked in procession at public festivals, and appeared at banquets in the same gowns Poppaea had once worn. Nero delighted in the discomfort this caused among senators and dignitaries, watching their carefully schooled expressions as they bowed to a youth they were compelled to address as Augusta. But Sporus's existence was not one of luxury, despite the gold and silks. He lived under the constant surveillance of the imperial court, his every word and gesture a test of how convincingly he could embody the dead empress. Any misstep, a laugh that didn't match Poppaea's melody, a glance held too long at another man could provoke Nero's suspicion, and suspicion, in Nero's Rome, was a slow poison. Privately, Nero's obsession deepened into ritual. He would summon Sporus at odd hours to sit beside him in candlelight while he composed songs or recited poetry to Poppaea. Sometimes he would speak to him as if he were truly her returned from the grave, asking about moments they had never shared, expecting answers drawn from memories that were never Sporus's to give. On other nights, the emperor would fall into silent contemplation, studying Sporus's face as if willing it to transform into the perfect mask of the woman he had killed. Rome, meanwhile, began to crumble around them. The Pisonian conspiracy had been crushed in a wave of purges, executions multiplied, and the Senate bent ever further under the emperor's paranoia. Grain shortages, military unrest, and the resentment of the provinces gnawed at the foundations of his rule. Yet inside the palace, Nero's world was narrowed to two figures, himself and the phantom bride he had created. It is here that Sporus's role shifts. No longer merely an ornament, he began to function as a stabilizing presence in Nero's most unstable moments. When the emperor erupted in rage at news of a rebellion in Gaul, Sporus was there to calm him, to coax him into sleep with soft words. When Nero feared betrayal from his closest advisors, Sporus became the one person he allowed in his private chambers without guards. Some historians have argued that Sporus in these last years wielded quiet influence over the emperor, not through political maneuvering, but through the strange intimacy of their shared isolation. He had been made into an image, but in the process he became a mirror. In Sporus, Nero saw not only Poppaea, but also his own need, his grief, and his madness reflected back at him. But this closeness was a trap. As Nero's reign teetered toward collapse in 68 AD, the line between reality and performance in their relationship had dissolved completely. Sporus was still addressed publicly as the empress, still dressed for appearances as though the empire was stable, even as legions marched in revolt and governors declared their independence. The end, when it came, would drag Sporus into a new nightmare, one where Nero's death did not free him, but instead bound him to yet another man who saw him not for who he was, but for the ghost he had been forced to become. In June of 68 AD, the empire finally broke its patience with Nero. Rebellions spread like fire across dry grass, first in Gaul, then Spain, then the legions along the Rhine. Even the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite protectors of the emperor, abandoned him in exchange for a bribe from the Senate. Alone, deserted, and declared an enemy of the state, Nero fled the city under cover of night with only a handful of loyal freedmen. Sporus went with him. It was a strange and desperate journey. Nero no longer had the gold or legions to shield himself, yet he still clung to the pageantry of the past. Sporus was made to ride beside him in full regalia, wearing Poppaea's jewels even as they took shelter in abandoned villas. But as the net closed in, the theatre collapsed. When word reached Nero that soldiers were on their way to arrest him, he resolved not to be taken alive. In the final moments, Sporus stood nearby as the emperor, unable to summon the courage to kill himself, begged a companion to drive a blade into his throat. The last words history records from Nero were, "Qualis artifex pereo." What an artist dies in me. With Nero gone, Sporus should have been free. But Rome was not a place where the beauty of a favoured imperial companion could simply be forgotten. He was now a living trophy, proof of the most infamous scandal of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. It was Otho, a former friend of Nero and briefly his successor, who first took Sporus into his household. But Otho's reign lasted only 3 months before he was overthrown by Vitellius, a man whose tastes were both cruel and theatrical. Vitellius knew of Sporus's history and decided to make a spectacle of it. He ordered the youth to take part in a public performance of the rape of Proserpina, a grim reenactment in which Sporus, dressed as the goddess, would be symbolically dragged into the underworld. It was not mere theatre. Vitellius intended it as humiliation before the Roman mob. Sporus understood the message. He would never again be seen as himself. He would be Poppaea forever, if not in Nero's arms, then as a grotesque parody in the arena. Rather than submit to this final degradation, Sporus chose death. Ancient accounts disagree on the method. Some say he took poison, others that he stabbed himself, but all agree that it was an escape he controlled. In a life where his identity had been rewritten by the will of emperors, this one act was entirely his own. And so Sporus died as he had lived in Rome's memory, not as himself, but as the shadow of a woman long dead, the ghost of Poppaea Sabina walking the marble halls of history. When Sporus's body was carried away, Rome barely paused. Vitellius's regime had its own chaos, armies clashing, provinces breaking away, and the slow bloody slide toward the year of the 4 emperors. Sporus's death was just another whispered footnote in the capital's endless cycle of scandal and violence. But the story of Sporus refused to vanish. In the taverns, in the smoky corners of the Subura, in the corridors of the Palatine, his name was spoken with that peculiar mix of pity, morbid curiosity, and scandalized fascination that Rome reserved for the beautiful and doomed. For the senatorial elite, he was an emblem of Nero's degeneracy. For the common people, he was a tragic figure caught in the machinery of imperial excess. The writers who came after, Suetonius, Dio Cassius, Tacitus, recorded his existence less out of sympathy than as evidence of how far Nero had fallen from the stoic virtues Rome claimed to prize. But in their accounts, something else lingers, an unease, as though they recognized that Sporus's fate was not entirely the result of one man's madness, but of a society that treated human beings as mutable objects to be reshaped for power, vanity, and pleasure. We do not know what Sporus's voice sounded like, or how he carried himself when no one was watching. We know only the shapes others forced upon him: a slave, a favorite, a bride, a ghost, a mockery. His real self is lost somewhere beneath layers of silk, jewels, and performance, buried more deeply than Poppaea's embalmed body ever was. Yet, the outline of his life, fleeting, tragic, and strange, casts a long shadow over the history of imperial Rome. In him, we see not just the extremes of Nero's obsession, but the way power can erase a person, and maybe, just maybe, the defiance in Sporus's final act, his refusal to play Vitellius's grotesque spectacle, was the only moment when he truly stepped out of the role others had written for him. In that, he was no longer Poppaea's ghost, no longer Nero's bride, no longer Rome's ornament. He was simply Sporus,